Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where today we're going to continue on in our look at the book of Genesis and kind of finish up this whole story about Abraham. We've been following his life for quite a few weeks now, and a few more things that are happening. One of the big things is we're going to be thinking now about the next generation as Abraham tries to find a wife for his son Isaac. And I wanted to just take a real brief look at Genesis chapter 23 and just kind of summarize it. I won't read any of it, but just give you an idea of what was going on there. And basically we come to the point where Sarah is now 127 years old and she dies. Now, that's a good ripe old age if you can live that long. And it was really nice to see how God had blessed them with Isaac, and so he must be, a young man by now. So Sarah was able to enjoy him for all those years, and now she passes away. But something very interesting happens here in this chapter, and that is we find that Abraham is in a bit of a dilemma because now he needs to find a place to bury Sarah, and he doesn't actually own any land. And this is kind of a head scratcher because remember, God promised to him this big promise that God made to Abraham that he would possess all of this land, and he describes the area that he was talking about. And now Abraham is towards the end of his life and he doesn't even own any land. Now, he was very prosperous and he had made some arrangements and some treaties with, King Abimelech, and they must have had some sort of agreement as to how to work together, but Abraham was probably more like a tenant farmer, but he technically and legally didn't own any of that land. So he had to make an arrangement, which is what he did. He made an arrangement with some of the local people there, a guy that owned some land, and he bought it. It was interesting that the person he went to buy the land was, his name was Ephron, and he was willing to give it to him, but Abraham refused to simply accept it because he wanted to make it legal that he actually owned that land. Well, this brings up a big question. What about that promise that God made to Abraham, that you're going to possess this land? He gets to the end of his life and he doesn't even have a place to bury his wife that he can legally call his own. And there's an answer to this question, and it's found in the book of Hebrews, and I think there's a great lesson that we can learn from that when we think about the promises that God makes to us, and when are they fulfilled? Well, Hebrews chapter 11 is called the chapter of faith, and it's a New Testament book, and within it they have this chapter that lists all these people in the Old Testament that lived these great lives of faith. People like Noah and of course Abraham and Moses and a number of other people, and it gives a brief history of what each one of them did and how they proved their faith to God by the things that they did. And it comes to kind of a conclusion, and it makes this one statement about all of those people of faith, including Abraham. And this is in Hebrews 11, 13, and 16. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So basically what this is saying is the promises, those really big promises that God made to Abraham, were never seen by him. But I think Abraham was okay with that because he understood that this was something that was going to be revealed over time. And it wasn't like he had, this miserable life. I mean, God blessed him tremendously because he lived a life of faith. So this life that he had on this earth was really great. And, he has this retirement situation where he's living at peace for these many years and enjoying his son. So things were good for him. And I don't think he resented the fact that he didn't see those big promises fulfilled in his life. And I think we can learn a lesson from that too, because God has made some really big promises to us as his followers, as believers. And, you know, this whole thing about heaven and this eternal kingdom that we will all be a part of. But we do have to wait for that. But our lives in the meantime, you know, we don't need to be discouraged because we can't see that right now. But we do see God's blessing in our life, just like Abraham did, day by day. And whenever we step out in faith and live a life of faith and obey God and do the, you know, live our lives the way that he wants us to, you just automatically are blessed. So I think there's a kind of an important lesson in that, in this fact that Abraham doesn't really see these promises, but he's not discouraged by that. So basically, that's what happens in Genesis chapter 23. But the real story we want to look at now is this whole story about how Abraham is trying to find a wife for his son Isaac. And as he goes through this process, you know, of course, Sarah just passed away, and I'm sure there was a great deal of sorrow in the family and within that community because everybody loved Sarah. But Abraham was looking to the future, and he knew it maybe at this point it was time to find a wife for his son Isaac. And so he does. And the way he does that is he calls his servant, his good, faithful servant, who we don't know his name. He's just described as Abraham's servant. And he sends him off, he commissions him to go and find a wife for Isaac. And there were 3 requirements that he had when he thought about finding a wife for Isaac. One of them was that he was not to marry one of the local girls. Remember, they were still living as foreigners, just like kind of like that verse we read. They were living as foreigners and strangers on this earth. And they really weren't part of that culture that they lived in Canaan. Basically, it was a bunch of Hittites, and, you know, they had a different religion, they had different cultural practices. Now, they got along fine, okay. You know, they had this compatibility, and they made these alliances with each other, but he still was not part of that culture, and he didn't want his son to marry someone outside his own culture. And so he wanted his servant to go back to the land where he grew up, to find his brother and the extended family there, and to choose a wife from amongst those people. Also, he didn't want Isaac to go off himself to try to find a wife. He insisted that this be something that was done, you know, outside of the realm of, I guess, Isaac's ability to get involved in the decision, which isn't kind of like the way we do things today in our culture. You know, you go off and it's kind of your responsibility to find the right woman or the right man to marry. But back in those days, it was the responsibility of the parents to arrange these marriages. And, you know, we still have cultures today that are like that, where it's the parents that find the husbands and the wives. And, you know, to be honest with you, I think if you looked at the divorce rates in either of those systems, you'd find out that the parents do just as good a job, maybe even a better job, picking wives for their kids than the kids do, you know, picking spouses for themselves. Well, that was the second requirement. And the third is probably the most important one. He wanted to be sure that God was involved in this decision. And when he commissioned his servant to find a wife, he made that very clear to him. He let him know that he wanted God to be the one that was really making the decision. We read that in verses 7 and 8 in Genesis 24, where he said that God, when he commissions his servant, he said, God will send his angel before you so that you can get a wife for my son from there. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. So, okay, Isaac was not to go. This was something the servant was going to do himself. And Abraham made it very clear to him that I don't want this to be your responsibility. If this woman will not come back, you'll find a woman. If she won't come back, I'm not going to fire you. Don't worry, you're not going to lose your job. But we're just going to put this all in God's hands. And as we see, that's what happens. So the servant packs up a bunch of camels, 10 camels in all, and I'm sure he had a bunch of other people going with him, and they head south to the land where Abraham's brother lived. And they probably took them quite some time to get there, maybe a few weeks, because it wasn't all that close, and they're just walking. So eventually he does get there into this town where Abraham's brother lives. He parks all his camels by the community well and just kind of sits there and waits. And I think the thing that's going through his mind now is, how in the world am I going to decide which of these women here would be Isaac's wife? And he comes up with a plan. Now, the setting is that he's sitting by a well. In the culture of that day, women would come to the wells in the morning to get the water that they would need throughout the course of the day. Then they would return at night, probably later in the afternoon, to get some more water to bring back to their homes for whatever needs they might have to do the dishes and wash up or whatever. So this is a good time to be hanging out looking for women, because they're all going to be there at the well. The only thing is, the servant doesn't really know how to discern who's going to be the right one. How could I tell? And he knows that Abraham didn't want it really to be his decision anyway, so he comes up with this plan. And the plan we read about is in verses 14 and 15. May it be that when I say to a young woman, please let down your jar that I may drink, and she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one that you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. So this is the servant's plan, to identify the woman. Now, if you think about it, these women had all been working, all day long. And the last thing they had to do was go to the well and get water to finish up all their chores for the day. And the idea of sticking around there and volunteering to feed all these, draw water for all these camels. We know there's 10 camels, and a camel can drink a lot of water. It must have taken a long time. And to expect any one of these women simply to volunteer to do that would be just very, very unlikely. And so it was kind of a good plan, because if he did find someone to do it, it would be almost like a miracle. And this one girl happens to come along. Her name is Rebecca. And I don't know, maybe she caught his attention for some reason. Turns out Rebecca is actually Abraham's brother's granddaughter. So there's this family tie. So she's a good candidate now for being a wife. And we read the next thing that happens in verses 17 and 19. The servant hurried to meet her and said, please give me a little water from your jar. Drink, my lord, she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. And after she had given him a drink, she said, I will draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink. And so this whole, prophetic thing that he thought would happen, that he was praying would happen, actually does happen. In a way, it's kind of like a little miracle, because you wouldn't expect anyone to do that. But this confirmed to the servant that this was the one that God had chosen. And that's kind of a wonderful thing. I know that when my wife and I were dating and talking, well, should we get married or not? And it was a decision that we didn't take very lightly, and really sought God's will. I have to be honest and say she probably was working a lot more on being sure that this was God's will than I was, because I was pretty sure we were supposed to get married. But I'm glad that we did put that in God's hands. And that's a good lesson for all of you Gen Zers out there who might be, at this stage in your life, you might be thinking about, who you're going to marry. And this is probably the biggest decision, one of the biggest decisions you'll ever make. And it's really good to include God in this decision. So anyway, the servant is very happy, and he's happy because he knows now the burden is off of him to find a wife, because it's been proven. And his reaction is just to give thanks to God. In verses 26 and 27, the man bowed down and worshiped the Lord, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master." And so Rebecca is, probably kind of bowled over by this whole thing, because he took, another thing we read is that he took a gold ring and a couple of gold bracelets as soon as he realized this was the woman that God wanted, and he gives it to her, and all of a sudden she's like, has to be flabbergasted, because she just, woke up that morning a regular, she wasn't a slave, she was a free woman, but she was just a humble servant, and, she was the one that went out to get the water and do her daily chores. And the idea of having these wonderful, lavish gifts that were given to her never would have occurred to her. So this is something that is really very special for her. She ends up going home. She tells her family about all the stuff that's happening. Then her brother Laban comes out to meet Abraham's servant, and he makes it official and invites him to come to their home. And they invite him for this big dinner, and it's big party time. But before eating, Abraham's servant insists, "I'm not going to eat until I explain to you what has just happened, who I am." And then he goes on in verses 34 to 35. He said, "I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has blessed my master abundantly, and he has become wealthy. He has given him sheep and cattle and silver and gold, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys." And then he goes on to tell the whole story about how Abraham had commissioned him to come and find a wife for his son Isaac. I don't really know, we can't know whether Nahor, who was Abraham's brother, how much contact he might have had with Abraham. And it could have been, 50 years ago was the last time he saw him, and he might not have had any idea what Abraham was up to or what had happened to him, even if he was dead or alive. And so the servant is able to tell them and explain to them that Abraham is doing fine. He's been blessed by God, and now he's looking for a wife for his son. And, they couldn't deny it. In verses 50 to 51, Laban and Bethuel answered, "This is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her, go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed." And so Rebekah's family is, I guess, very impressed by the way that God made it clear that, Rebekah was the right one. And I think we can understand the importance of, people marrying people of the same faith. That Nahor and Abraham grew up, and we know that their father was a man of God, and he instructed both of them to follow God. So that Nahor, Abraham's brother, was, in tune with God, and he understood, he could discern that this was something that God was doing. And then that made it that much easier for them to just say, okay, this is kind of out of the blue, but this is definitely something God wants. So, we cannot, who are we to challenge the decision of God? And so they say, okay, she can go. But they did ask one thing. They asked whether she could stay for 10 days. Can she just stay here a little while longer so we get a chance to say goodbye to her and, get her prepped for this big change in her life? And but the servant says no, because Abraham is waiting for her. And, he refuses. He said if she's going, she must go now. And now we learn something a little bit more about Rebecca. We already learned that she was a very humble servant, and that she must have loved animals, because she didn't want those poor camels to go thirsty either. And she was willing to, roll up her sleeves and get them fed and take care of that need. But also, I think that she was a woman of faith, because the family didn't make the decision for her. They looked at her and they said, if she's willing to go, then she can go. And in verses 58 to 59, this is her response. I will go, she said. So they sent their sister Rebekah on her way, along with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah, and they said to her, our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the cities of their enemies. And in a way, they were kind of repeating the promise that God had already made to Abraham. And now Rebekah plays the role of the one that is going to receive, I guess you could say, inherit that promise. So these blessings that the family give to her upon her time of departure really become almost prophetic, and they totally match up with the promise that God had already made to Abraham. So this is very interesting. Now we're getting towards the end of the story, but just one more scene within this story. And now we're going to go back. Of course, Rebecca packs up all her stuff. She hops on a camel and starts heading north. And the next scene that we have in this story is back up where Abraham lives. And we now see Isaac, who decides he's just going to go for a walk in a field and do some meditating. Which tells me one thing about him. We already know a few things about Isaac. One is that he loved his father. He was obedient to the point where he was willing to die, for his father. And so we know that he also was a man of faith, that he was a man who followed after God. And that's probably why he went out in the field. I don't know if he was out there thinking about the fact that his mother is now, dead, and maybe mourning that loss, or if he even knew that Abraham had sent the serpent out to find a wife for him. We just don't know. But we know now that he is a man of God who is sitting there meditating, waiting. And the next thing that happens in verse 63, he looked up and he saw camels, and you can almost picture this. And Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, who is that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant asked. So she took her veil and covered herself. And of course, this would have been something that was a custom of that day. The woman wouldn't show herself to the husband. We still sort of have that custom today. In a wedding, it's always bad luck if the bridegroom sees the bride on the day of the wedding. So she wears the veil, and then the veil is lifted, as part of our custom as well. So she knew that this was the one she was going to marry, and she, according to the custom of the day, she would cover her face. And the way the story ends, verses 66 to 67, the servant told Isaac all that he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. She became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Isn't that nice to have a story that has a happy ending? It's almost like one of those Hallmark movies where, you get the man and the woman and eventually they meet. Only this was much better because God had his hand in it. And what we're going to do now, this is the end of the story, and my intention today was just to kind of go through the story so we know what the storyline was. Next time I want to take some time and think about some of the spiritual lessons that we can learn from this whole event. And, thinking about how important it is to commit our really big decisions, like who you marry, to God, and allow Him to, have a say in this very important question. So next time we're going to learn some spiritual lessons and see some of the things that are illustrated in the story that we just looked at, and just be glad that we had a nice happy ending here today. So I want to encourage you to join us next time as we dig into the story a little deeper and try to learn some spiritual lessons from it. So I hope you can be here next time with us on Gen Z Bible Class.